merely a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 79 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. This episode concerns a dream that I had this week. It's not all the time that I'll do a whole episode based on this dream, but given the fact that I was talking about the Arcturians last week, and previously I've done many episodes on music, it was very enlightening to have a very lucid dream where I actually saw something that built on rather than changed my understanding of what musical creativity is, but also what is the nature of gifts and aptitude. It was something that also, in a sense, gave me an experience in a very coherent and structured way that suggested a particular way that artistic creation occurs. The dream was music, specifically the creation of music by artists whose work has often been described as existing at the edge of the known. In this particular case, I had dreams about Radiohead and David Gilmour, with probably a splattering of Pink Floyd in there as well. What was very unusual about this dream wasn't just simply that these musicians were there, but the context in which they appeared. They weren't working so much alone, or just with their fellow band members or production assistants. They weren't working in a way that we ordinarily would imagine composition taking place. This episode wants to look at that dream, and I want to use it as a starting point to ask the big question again: where does music come from? And why does it seem to come more readily and more fully and more convincingly to some people rather than others? So the dream. And in the dream, David Gilmour was composing. The process wasn't particularly solitary. It resembled a form of workshop or music laboratory. And musical phrases were being tested and adjusted and refined, but not only by human participants. There were other contributors there. They were intelligences, they were presence, they were entities. I couldn't quite clearly see them, although I got a sense that they appeared to be human in that respect, like any other musicians. I was obviously seeing it purely through eyes. I didn't see myself in that dream. It was as if I was maybe shooting a documentary of something that I was seeing. And to my knowledge, they weren't aware that I was there. These other musicians or these entities were working as closely as you would imagine any band members would work together. They seemed to influence the texture, the phrasing, the tone, the rhythm, the space, everything. The interaction was very collaborative, and I think it was very inspirational. But it was as if this was just normal. At one point during the dream, I was shown artwork that was prepared for the albums. I think they were actually CDs rather than LPs. And they were alternate versions of Pink Floyd albums that I know and love, or unknown Pink Floyd albums or David Gilmour compositions, solo albums. Never seen the covers before. They were completely different, but fully formed, including I could see the CDs in the slots, and I could see all the credits written on the album of who had composed it and who had got involved. And I think I saw 3 different covers, and on the credits, there was obviously David Gilmour. I think even at one point there was Roger Waters and the other members of Floyd who don't perform anymore. But there were sort of non-recognizable names that I'd never heard of. And as I remember, they were like Mia and Pia. They were sort of first names only, like in an order, and you'd read it down as they were there. And they seemed to represent a stable group of contributors because they appeared on all the albums. And I seem to remember seeing one of the most famous Pink Floyd albums, I think it was Dark Side of the Moon, and I opened up the cover of this almost alternate version of the album, and listed amongst the composers was these 3 or 4 other contributors, Mia and Pia and the others. And it was very normal, as if that was where they were. Now, of course, I knew within my dream, because I was sort of in a very lucid dream, that this can't be right, because they're not members of Pink Floyd and they didn't contribute to this album. But in this case, they were clearly showing as contributors to this album. So the implication within that dream was very clear to me, that these collaborators were not living humans, they were not fictional, and they were described implicitly as being, if you like, non-local intelligences, entities that consistently worked with Gilmour and his bandmates across the projects, but which don't appear in our accepted historical narrative. So the dream seemed to be factual, rather than just some form of metaphor. Next, I saw Radiohead, and it's a band that I've only recently become acquainted to, and I know certainly that members of Radiohead are well known for being remarkably creative and very different in the way that they approach composition and sounds. And here the same structure appeared with Radiohead. The band members were recognizable to me. And again, they weren't alone. Musical ideas emerged through the interaction with this extended group of musicians. These additional intelligence was shaping rhythm and harmonic instability, emotional pacing. And yes, I could see that Radiohead's music was quite disquieting and emotionally precise and strangely impersonal. And despite its intensity, I could see that there was an awful lot of practicing going on, a lot of attempts at refining the sounds that were coming through. In the dream, this wasn't really explained to me in any form of stylistic or structural way. The music was just being composed in a dialogue with something not bound to individuals and their individual psychology. I think this is notable because many artists who work together have often described similar sensations, that the musical ideas that they have do not necessarily originate when they're consciously paying attention, but seem to arrive complete or nearly complete from somewhere else. The final sequence that I can remember was I was with a group of people who I sort of recognized. They were, I think, probably ex-colleagues of mine, but not all of them did I recognize, but I seem to feel part of that group. And we were on a sort of excursion. Maybe this was this journey to these halls of music, I don't know. And the facilitator there was saying to us, okay, what I'd like you all to do tonight is travel to London and go and see a show and have a restful evening. And he handed out a sheet of paper, and I remember seeing 2 or 3 items of really very interesting shows that I could see, but nothing I'd ever heard of before. And one particularly stuck out at me, and that was that Peter Gabriel was doing like a live residence in London, performing his music, but in collaboration with Storm Thorgerson, who is or was the main Pink Floyd collaborator for his album for all their album covers and artwork. And Peter Gabriel, I understand, also used to do some album artwork with this guy as well. And this was a show that was put into London, and it was apparently a very successful show. And all his music, all Peter Gabriel's music, was in collaboration with his artwork, which was moving. It was visual in the respect that it was not just static artwork. It was moving with the music in a sort of very flowy sort of way in the background, and it clearly in time with the music. And again, it was artwork that I'd never seen before. And I saw it in tremendous detail, and it was, Peter Gabriel's face, and it was moving through different states of being. But it struck me as Storm Thorgerson died in 2013, and yet the collaboration seemed to be ongoing, as if here in this dimension, he hasn't died, and this collaboration is something that is up and running, and people can go and see it. It was, I remember, being very technically advanced, and I remember being able to look at the sort of the video that was going on of his various amazing artworks and all the effects. And I remember thinking, this is incredibly detailed and very futuristic in that respect, because I don't think I've ever seen anything quite so clear and massive, before. It was, if you like, a retrospective or a tribute, but it was an active creation. So the implication was that this artistic collaboration wasn't constrained by any form of chronology or by death. It was something that was happening simultaneously to our dimension. Now, before we talk about any of this further, I have mentioned, obviously, non-local consciousness in previous podcasts, and I think it's a tremendously interesting subject. And I wanted just to remind those listeners who perhaps missed that, what exactly the issues involved in non-local consciousness are in respect of music creation. It's a long tradition of philosophical, artistic, and scientific stuff that goes into the idea that creativity is not a process of invention, but of access to somewhere else. And it goes back even to Plato, who argued that artists take an ideal form rather than a construct that is made up of original objects. And throughout history, the Romantic thinkers described inspiration as a form of possession. And many modern musicians describe ideas of arriving rather than being deliberately produced. Now, in neuroscience, if you look into it, the subjective experience corresponds to a measurable change in brain activity. Studies of composers and improvising musicians have shown reduced activity in certain regions of the brain associated with conscious self-monitoring, and increased activity in networks linked to memory, association, and imagination, particularly what they call the default mode network. That network is active during dreaming, mind-wandering, and internal simulation. It's less concerned with control than with integration. In other words, when musicians report that music comes through them, this corresponds to a brain state in which the conscious regulation is reduced and associative processes dominate. This does not require any belief in external entities, but it does raise an important point. The sense of authorship is somehow reduced during peak creativity. Now, some theorists take this even further. They argue that consciousness itself may not be fully localized in the brain. In this view, the brain functions less as a creator and more of a receiver or filter, and it selects and it shapes information that exists in a broader field. From this understanding, artistic talent may involve a really unusual ability to access this field with tremendous clarity and consistency. Now, that idea appears in the literature under many names, whether it's collective unconsciousness, non-local consciousness, transpersonal cognition. Now, while none of these concepts are empirically verified in the strict scientific sense, they persist because they align very closely to how artists describe their own experiences. The dream I described earlier certainly aligns with this model. Music seems to exist as a structured system, independent of any single mind, and some individuals are able to access and translate it with much greater fidelity. Now, science always gets into the way here, but it offers a much more conservative explanation about what all this is, and research is indicating that musical ability seems to correlate with differences in brain connectivity, the way the ears process information, emotional sensitivity, the motor system in the body that allows some people to have better flexibility with their fingers or whatever else. And these differences traditionally are explained by both genetics and experience and practice. Although clearly there is no single musical gene, there seems to be a combination of traits. Heightened sensitivity to pitch and rhythm and the efficient integration between auditory and motor regions and all that strong emotional engagement tends to be something that comes as a capacity to get into a state that allows exceptional ability in this regard. Now, training can amplify these traits, but does not fully explain them. Some individuals appear definitely predisposed, neurologically at least, to process sound and structures in a way that supports the complexity of music. But this explanation to me really leaves too much unsolved and unresolved. I think neural efficiency does not explain why certain ideas feel meaningful or why they appear fully formed rather than sort of incrementally constructed, like you would see perhaps in that Beatles documentary Get Back, where all the Beatles seem to be riffing off each other and creating the end piece together. Although quite often it's clear that much of the music has come into the group setting already pretty much written, and it's just up to the others to add their bits to it and to refine it before it's laid down and recorded. Now, many of you will remember Esther. She was the wonderful pianist who helped me in previous episodes when I was channeling lyrics and music, and she interpreted it and turned it into beautiful long-form forms of music. And I asked her the questions as a professional musician as to how did she see inspiration and how did she see aptitude? How did she see people with musical gifts? Because obviously, with all her experience as a professional musician, she must have seen all of this. And I asked her about, yes, musical gifts and talent and what they really are and how they work from her point of view. What she sent back wasn't a neat answer. It was really a stream of thoughts, questions, and doubts, and lived experience. And honestly, I think that's what makes it interesting. She starts by saying that, yes, sometimes genetics plays a role, but very often, especially in music, children of artists follow their parents' path, not because it's their calling, but because it's expected of them. And some become excellent musicians, highly skilled, well-trained, technically impressive, but they never quite discover their own gift, and they end up mimicking instead of creating. And I certainly can see that when you look at these Asian children in YouTube videos, who it looks like their parents have almost whipped them into shape to learn how to play the piano like a performing monkey, and they don't really seem to have any emotional involvement and no connection with what they're actually doing. It's almost as if they're just performance monkeys, a little bit like you saw in Amadeus again, when young Mozart was brought to the court of Leopold in Austria, and his father looking very proudly on as this little tiny kid, sitting on a very high chair, was performing the most intricate pieces of piano playing or harpsichord playing. But it wasn't really with any heart. Perhaps using Mozart is the wrong example. But Esther gave an example of someone who truly wanted to be a pilot, but he ended up, probably because of having wonderful teachers, he became a violinist. And he was in the right environment where he could learn his craft, and he became an extremely competent violinist as a result. But yes, it wasn't really aligned with his real desire. His own story was the opposite. And, I think in terms of Esther, she said that she had no musicians in her family at all, yet she remembers herself singing and dancing for as long as she can remember. Music was something she chose, and her parents supported her first choice. Then she shifted into something a little bit more philosophical. She said that what if giftedness doesn't come from genetics at all? What if it comes from the outside and from a deeper connection to something non-local, some kind of shared consciousness? And I love that she's thought that one. I certainly feel it might be that way. She talks about art, music, and sports, and that these could be non-verbal ways of communicating something larger, almost like translating messages from a central consciousness, a creator, or what some might call God. And that raises the other question, are gifted people chosen in some way? And if they are, who are they chosen by? And why do these gifts often come simultaneously with limitations? She points out how many extraordinary talented musicians never ever perform because of stage fright, and others sabotage themselves through fear and laziness or lack of support. And sometimes the environment they're in kills their gift. Sometimes the person kills their gift. And at first glance, it feels quite absurd. Why give a gift to someone who can't or won't fully use it? And statistically, most talented people never reach their full potential. Only a very small, fortunate group manage to develop their gifts completely. Some even feel trapped in their talent and eventually even hate having it. Esther mentioned Steve Parry of Journey, who ended up leaving the band because he'd lost his emotional connection to the music, and he ended up needing drugs and alcohol just to feel something on stage. And so Esther asks, what's the point of having the ability to move millions of people if over time you go numb yourself? And how many performers burn out or become copies of their former selves? Is fame, pressure, and constant performance the natural enemy of true talent? And she reminded me of Amy Winehouse, who inevitably comes to mind. Another uncomfortable thought, some gifted people are deeply sensitive, empathetic, and kind, and she notes that others are gifted psychopaths or worse. Some painters, musicians, actors, they can be brilliant but can be truly atrocious human beings. How can that be, and how can that exist in the same mind? She also distinguishes between different kinds of creativity. Some people don't create from absolute zero. They develop ideas that already exist and give them, as she calls them, breadcrumbs, and they'll bake you a beautiful loaf of bread. That's how she sees herself when she composes. She feels she's shaping something that's already there, And when she reads sheet music, ideas flood in, and she imagines what the composer wanted, blends it with her own experience, and creates a personal interpretation. And I like that idea too. But again, it's interesting, she mentions how all these ideas just flood in. So where are they flooding in from? There are those who seem to create from nothing. But interestingly, she notes that today, raw creation from zero is usually quite mediocre, while other musicians who transform that mediocrity into something great are much more successful. They can turn mediocrity into a great song or a great film score or a great film or a performance. And finally, I think she lands on something really crucial. There isn't just musical talent. There are infinite kinds of talent within music itself, such as composing, improvising, interpreting, accompanying, soloing, storytelling through soundtracks, and each individual person tends to excel in a particular different area. And perhaps it's quite rare for people to excel in all areas at the same time. And so who decides where someone will excel? Is this fate? And she questions, what even is fate? So, yeah, she gave me a very good answer, and she wonders if all of this is something that happens to us before we're born. Is this something we've chosen? Is there some kind of direction that's instilled in the child that gives that child the idea to explore gifts and limits and paths and endings? And she ended her communication with me by saying that really these kind of questions send her spiraling, and that she could think about them all night. But although it's a very wide answer, she wonders, of course, as a professional musician, quite where all this comes from as well. So really we're left with two partial explanations. One suggests that music is produced by the brain under particular conditions of training and neural organization. And the other suggests that music exists independently and that some individuals are able to access it more directly than others. I don't think these explanations are mutually exclusive. The dream I experienced does not demand belief. It offers one model, one that resonates with my lived experience and the lived experience of many artists. Perhaps creativity then is not about ownership. Perhaps it's about allowing it in and sharing the ownership. So in that case, of course, death may not silence creative agents entirely. It may simply remove their physical interface. And if that's so, then music and those who make it may never be entirely local to the world. So this made me want to do a little bit more research into rock and popular music and find out a lot of the musicians who are saying that music seems to be coming from outside of them. And of course, one of the most famous ones is Paul McCartney. And we've discussed this before, that he famously dreamed the song Yesterday, fully formed, including the melody and the structure. And he was so surprised by it that he spent quite a few weeks asking others if it already existed, assuming he had unknowingly received it. And he said, I think, quote, "It was as if it was handed to me." So I think that's one of the clearest documented cases of dream-based composition in popular music. Now, John Lennon frequently described songs as arriving whole, particularly during periods of emotional intensity. And he spoke of being a receiver rather than a craftsman. And later, he explicitly links songwriting to altered consciousness and ego dissolution. He was obviously quite famous, as many people in his time were, for taking LSD and other psychoactive substances, psychedelics. And without doubt, psychedelics enable creativity to be enhanced and for ideas to come into your mind either from entities that you're meeting in your trip, or just expanding your brain's ability to receive the information from these non-local consciousness entities. David Bowie repeatedly described songwriting as tuning in, and he used what he called his cut-up techniques, where he would actually write lots of random sentences, cut them up into little strips, and then arrange them almost at random to create a full lyric. And he did that so he could remove conscious control from it and allow external control, external structures to emerge. And he said, and I quote, "I feel like a conduit." He discussed ideas about hovering above himself and seeing himself having done something already before actually doing it. Prince, one of the strongest modern examples, and he said music came from God or from the ether. He often recorded entire songs in a single take, claiming he was simply capturing what arrived. And he worked compulsively, as though afraid the signal would stop. Brian Eno, he's explicitly rejected the idea of the artist as the originator. He describes creativity as setting up conditions for something else to happen. And he views music as emerging from systems much larger than individual intention. And he's strongly aligned with the non-authorial creativity model. Kate Bush spoke of songs arriving suddenly, sometimes frighteningly complete, described music as something she entered into rather than made. She would have very strong, intuitive, dream-like compositions. Tom Waits described songs as knocking on his door, famously said he told inspiration to come back later when driving. He treated creativity as an external visitor with agency. Bob Dylan, he repeatedly denied understanding where songs came from. He claimed some songs arrived from beyond, and later alluded to a deal with something external in interviews, but he didn't really elaborate on that, which probably picks up on a lot of the mystique of people like Jimmy Page, perhaps having made deals with the devil in order to be able to create amazing sounds and music. Radiohead, of course, as we've mentioned, Tom York and Johnny Greenwood describe music as emerging as emotional or energetic states. And York has spoken of ideas appearing during liminal states and disassociation. And Greenwood has described music as discovered rather than built. The great Jimi Hendrix described music as visions and colours. And he said ideas arrived when he was half asleep. He treated music as a force moving through him, not controlled by him. And the classical composers, we've of course talked to different musicians on this podcast before, but most definitely Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is often seen as one of the clearest historical examples, and he wrote entire compositions that appeared fully formed in his mind. He describes simply writing them down, or as in the play and the movie, God was almost giving dictation, according to his nemesis Salieri. He emphasized that conscious effort was minimal once reception occurred, and his sheet music was notorious for being totally without any form of corrections. Ludwig van Beethoven described ideas arriving suddenly during walks or reverie. He struggled to capture ideas rather than invent them, and he spoke of music as something already existing. Johann Sebastian Bach, who we spoke to on a podcast, he explicitly believed music was divinely sourced. He thought that some of the works that he wrote, such as Soli Deo Gloria, were written for him to bring into the world. He viewed himself as just a vessel and not an originator. Franz Schubert wrote music at extraordinary speed. He claimed songs arrived complete, and often he was unable to explain how the compositions emerged. Claude Debussy spoke of music arising from dreams and impressions, and he viewed himself as translating something rather than composing conventionally. Olivier Messiaen explicitly stated music came from outside human time. He linked composition to mystical states and religious visions. He would hear complex rhythms internally before he actually put them into musical notations. Erik Satie claimed some works were dictated to him. He maintained an intentionally strange, detached relationship to the authorship of his music. And jazz musicians are very famous for this feeling, which is probably very, very symbolic because it's in their music, this free-form, almost inspirational interpretation of sound, the ability just to make things up as you go along. And John Coltrane, one of the strongest cases of this spiritual reception, claimed, for instance, a love supreme was received during a spiritual awakening, and he described music as prayer and transmission, and he believed he was accessing universal sound structures. Miles Davis claimed music arrived in states of detachment or exhaustion, and he relied on intuition rather than planning, and he often said he was listening more than deciding. Thelonious Monk spoke cryptically about music coming from elsewhere, and he frequently said he didn't know where the ideas came from. He treated music as something completely autonomous. Herbie Hancock, he described surrendering control to allow music to emerge. Keith Jarrett, probably the clearest jazz example of channeling. He described solo concerts as fully improvised transmissions. He said he did not know what he was playing until after it had happened, and he viewed himself as a medium. And Sun Ra claimed extraterrestrial origins. He said that music came from cosmic sources, and he created compositions as interdimensional communication. So my theory, it's probably not my theory, it's just a feeling I have and probably a theory I've read, I don't know, and maybe somebody said this before, but you often hear that people with brains that are not considered to be how do you put this? They call it neurodivergent individuals, people who have autism or on the autism spectrum with ADHD, dyslexia, or atypical sensory processing. They're disproportionately represented among exceptional musicians, mathematicians, and people who are better at pattern-based thinking. Rain Man comes to mind. Everyone must have seen that, where Dustin Hoffman plays a neurodivergent individual who on the face of it appears to be stupid and dumb, but has this incredible, what you'd call genius level of ability with numbers. This isn't particularly controversial. It's well documented. But what is controversial is why. The suggestion that neurodivergent brains might be better at accessing non-local consciousness, although that can't be tested directly, it seems to me completely self-evident, and it reveals something that neuroscience just doesn't know about our brains and how our brains work. What is clear about people with neurodivergence is that they have a different sensory processing mechanism, they have different attention regulation, they have a different way of their brain networking and connecting, and their inhibitions and their filtering are very different from non-neurodivergent people. Many neurodivergent individuals show very, very reduced filtering, which means that their brains are less aggressive about suppressing information that is deemed to be irrelevant by other people. Of course, in everyday life, this can be overwhelming. And in pattern-rich domains, music, mathematics, physics, and all of that, it can be a tremendous advantage to them. One of the most consistent findings in autism and these related conditions is differences in predictive processing. Neurotypical brains are heavily predictive, and they filter incoming information based on expectation, prior belief, relevance, social relevance, and neurodivergent brains are often relying less on this predictive stuff and more on raw sensory input. And the result generally is a much greater sensitivity to detail, less conceptual compression, very much more high fidelity perception. And in music, this can mean hearing structure where others just hear noise. Or in mathematics, it can mean seeing relationships without metaphor. And importantly, this also means suppressing less internally generated imagery and association. As always, I'm interested in talking to the dead. And the reason I'm talking about this in such detail today is because all of this can look like channeling. It can look like individuals are able to channel music. In other words, they are talking to the dead. And from the inside, a brain that seems to filter less and predicts less and suppresses less and integrates more shows that these ideas are not authored by the person. They're just appearing. They don't require an external source to explain it, but they show that there is creativity that is external, and the idea is coming without conscious intention. The brain is not saying, oh, this is mine, this is my work. It's accepting that there's another mechanism behind it. And this comes through such as in ways like sudden insights and mathematical intuition and musical phrases arriving whole, and people who have creative leaps of ideas during their dreams. Now, neurodivergent brains experience this more often and more intensely. So there isn't an awful lot of argument that people that we call geniuses or people who we think who have exceptional gifts are not always quite the same as everybody else. There is quite often amongst these people a certain neurodivergent ability that we can see. Many of the capacities that we value most, like musical genius or mathematical insight or radical creativity, come from these brains which are, let's call them atypical. They're not better or worse, they're just differently organized, and their greatest strengths often come with genuine costs to the people. Often they don't fit in with society, or they're condemned as being slightly odd, or sometimes they're very socially awkward, or can't explain things in the same ways that other people can explain things. And it marginalizes them in society, and quite often they end up having to take medications, and in the worst cases, institutionalized. But whatever it is, these geniuses of the creative field very often are not really like you and I. But it's just not a foolish question to say, well, why? What is it about their brains? What is it about them that's allowing them to be so different from us? Obviously, this has arisen naturally in terms of biology. But when you break it down, I think there's so much more to it than just biology. Now, lastly, I wanted to ask a little bit then about these particular people with genius levels and those who have gifts and those who seem to have predispositions and others don't. I often think, you see on YouTube, a 9-year-old boy who's just beaten the world chess champion. Or you see sitting on a piano stool a 6-year-old Asian girl playing piano with an amazing sublimity and just as good as an adult, maybe 30, 40 years older than her. How does this happen? What distinguishes a great artist from a competent one? Is it training? Is it intelligence, genetics, or something less tangible? Now, scientific research suggests that musical ability correlates with difference in brain structure and connectivity, particularly in the way people are understanding hearing, but also in the way that they can use their hands, as we said, or their mouth, and the ability to be able to understand things in an emotional sort of way. But there's never been identified a particular musical gene. But, it's not enough just to say that they've got a special brain, or they've got a special ability to connect their brain to their muscles. So why some people can become great musicians and most cannot? Well, there is no single cause. Modern neuroscience is quite clear in one point that there is no single explanation for exceptional musical ability. No single gene, no single brain region, no single environmental factor. Instead, elite musical performance seems to come as the convergence of many factors, and they show very early in a child's life. But it's an extremely rare thing to have in combination, and which is why the scientists describe musical genius as appearing in clusters rather than some form of smooth gradient where lots of people have it. I think with piano playing, it requires unusually tight integration between the auditory cortex and being able to hear pitch and harmony and timing, with the motor cortex in terms of finger movement, being able to plan, being able to understand timing, precision, error correction. These are highly skilled traits that skilled pianists consistently show. Now, there has been an analysis on the brains of musicians, of course, and they show greater white matter connectivity. They show more efficient signal transmission. And they have, from an earlier age, a very complex motor automation process going on. So it means that the brains of elite pianists, for instance, don't seem to work any harder than most people. They just work more economically. And children who play at professional levels have often shown this integration for years than before your average learners. Some children are born with exceptionally fine pitch discrimination, and they can have what's called perfect pitch. But that is something that I'm quite familiar with, because when I was very young, my parents, both being musicians, clearly wanted to shape my environment around music and wanted me to become a musician as well. And they noticed that I had this very unusual ability to listen to the pips when it was 6 o'clock. And on the radio in those days, you used to get like a beep, beep, beep just before it was 6 o'clock. And it was a particular pitch. And it was a family joke that I was the only one in the family who could always get the pitch completely right. They sent me to have myself tested, and I went through a test which in those days involved putting a record on, and as I remember, a bunch of tones would be played, and then you had to repeat the tones that you heard, or they would play a piece of music, and then they'd play another piece of music, and you had to decide which bit was different, or then they would play another piece of music and play another piece of music, and then they'd play a third piece of music, and then you would have to say, how would the first piece of music start in pitch, and things like that, as I remember. And I got it 100% right. And I remember the music teacher, when he expressed my results, he was just absolutely beside himself, and he said, you have what is called perfect pitch. And I remember him telling my father, and I was so proud because I was pretty useless at everything else at school, but suddenly I was this boy with perfect pitch. Unfortunately, it's not like winning the lottery, really. It did absolutely nothing for me, and it couldn't really help me do my schoolwork. And in the end, I had to give up music because my schoolwork was suffering so badly, which was a shame. But had I decided to become a musician, no doubt that ability, that gift, would have been quite useful. But why did I have this gift? Could it be that in another life I had been a musician? Could it be that that perfect pitch ability is something that would become useful to me in later life? Well, I'm sitting here at the age of 65, and I can't say that it has, apart from being able to tell what note a song will start on as soon as it's announced on the radio. So, finally, what do these dreams mean? Why am I having them now? Well, I've thought about that long and hard for the last few days, and I think it must link somewhat to the channeling of the Arcturians, or whoever they were last week. Clearly, they are there as very creative individuals. Maybe somehow these individuals that I've made contact with now are starting to show me more and more the complex interplay between non-local intelligence or interdimensional beings and our physical world. They think this is the time to show me and to link me to that. And I think most definitely in the next few podcasts, I'm going to get involved far more in the channeling process of these beings. And I believe that my dreams are going to become more and more vivid and show more and more different aspects of how perhaps humanity has been influenced by non-local entities, non-local intelligence, non-local consciousness, since its inception. I don't think this information makes musicians seem any less to me. That whatever they are, Pink Floyd, they created a monstrous body of work, and whether they know it or not, the collaboration that they've received non-locally has probably been a huge help to them. Obviously, artists often who find a problem with this communication, they call it sort of writer's or creative block. It suddenly stops. I obviously had that myself when Titan disappeared at one point, and I had to start learning to open up connectivity networks myself, which I've managed to do. So I'm fascinated by this subject. I hope you are too. I've really enjoyed doing some research and talking to you about it. I want to perhaps think about it over the next week during the Christmas period, and hopefully by the next podcast, I'll have a much clearer idea of what I'm going to talk about next in terms of the effects that interdimensional entities are having on us, not just in terms of creativity, but in terms of organizing humanity, daily life, the way that the planet functions. I'm convinced we're not alone, and we have these very benevolent entities, I hope, looking out for our best life. We'll see. So with that, happy holidays, happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, happy everything to all of you. I've really enjoyed coming back to my podcast again since October, and I will be back again in January 2026. Bye-bye.